Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonerty. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals, to state senators, to mayors, to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
Welcome to An Honorable Profession. I'm Debbie Cox Bultan, CEO of the New Deal. We're proud to support some of the amazing leaders you hear on this podcast. In this episode, I speak with Jack Schnirman, who's wrapping up his tenure as the Comptroller of Nassau County, New York, where he was focused on transparency, accountability, and using data to drive policy decisions. I hope you'll enjoy the conversation as much as I did, hearing about some of the specific initiatives he championed to fulfill campaign promises, about how hard and important it is to focus on culture change, what it's really like to run for office for the first time, and the factors that went into his decision not to seek another term. Jack Schnirman, welcome to An Honorable Profession.
Thanks so much, Debbie. I am so excited to be with you.
It's so fun to talk to you. And we are talking as you finish up your term as Nassau County Comptroller. And I thought that I would just start with the question of what is a county comptroller for people who don't know what that means?
Well, first of all, you just stepped into exactly the piece that I've spent 4 years talking about. And my initial question was, what is the difference between a comptroller and a controller? And the very simple answer is comptroller, C-O-M-P, is more public sector, controller is more private sector. A wise comptroller in the public sector once said to me, tell people MP stands for money police. And that kind of works for people. For the 8 to 12-year-old bracket, we talk about a giant video game controller controlling the finances. But essentially, the chief fiscal officer do the audits, the accounting, the finances. But my view of it is the hub of nerdery. It is the in-house think tank within government. It's the place where you put out the policy reports, where you do the number crunching, where you do the fiscal transparency. And I think, my mission, and I think we've succeeded now, was to really reinvent the way people look at the comptroller's office in our county. It's a big county. We've got 7,500 workers, an average a $3.5 billion budget. We're the premier suburb right next to New York City. And for too long, it had been run like a sort of, small town, essentially, not like a major regional enterprise the way that it really is. And New Deal gave me the opportunity to chat with, folks on the state level and Tobias in Oregon and Illinois and Pennsylvania and Rhode Island to really pick the brains of the big boys. And I say big boys because, unfortunately for me, they're all about twice the height that I am.
They are about twice the height you are.
Yeah. But I think ultimately we've sort of reinvented, the way that our office does business. We started a policy and research unit that didn't exist before and put out, reports looking at how we can do things better, what the best practices are. We've, stolen lots of great ideas from New Deal in terms of whether it be future of work or all kinds of stuff on equity. And it's been a really, really fun 4 years. At the beginning, we said, these are the 4 priorities. And this last year, we've been saying, we've done all 4 and more. And that's all I could ever ask for.
That's a perfect segue. I have to take a point of personal privilege here and say that, first of all, you're right about the treasurers, Democratic treasurers. I guess you have to be over 6 feet to be in that club. It's crazy. But secondly, you were somebody that was on our radar screen before you ran for office, because a lot of those people were calling us and saying, hey, keep an eye on this one. When he runs for office, he should be a New Deal leader. So you were the admiration was mutual for sure. I will say that. But it's a perfect segue, because literally my next question was to ask you about these 4 key priorities that you ran on. I will say them and you can tell me if I'm right. I've got, I know that you talked about opening up up and modernizing county government. You wanted to conduct smart audits. You wanted to reform the county contracting system, and you wanted to get the public involved in the comptroller's work. So first of all, do I have that right? And second of all, how do you feel about, some of the things you accomplished? Is there maybe one or two things that you're most proud of?
So you got the 4 exactly right. And I did the crazy thing of putting out our top 4 priorities in June of my campaign. I said, if I'm elected, these are the 4 things I'm going to do. I said it in really a high degree of specificity so that when transition started, that's what we planned around. When the first day of work came and we took office, handed it out to not just my management team, but all of the civil service and said, this is what we're accountable to do. And it was what we measured ourselves against throughout the year, but we put out annual updates on it. And I think that helped us drive towards not just doing the 4, but really, blowing them out of the water. So, I'd say a couple of things that were the really proudest accomplishments. And the first is we started a transparency portal. Nassau County was one of those places that got a D- in transparency. It was where you had to fill out the freedom of information request just to get, basic financial information, dig through papers in an attic or a basement. And it was purposely done that way. There was no coincidence as to why those things worked that way. So the sea change and the culture change is to create, a really modern open data transparency portal, which we did ultimately at the end of our first year, called Open Nassau. It's opennassau.nassaucountiny.gov. And we launched all the things that you would imagine you could do. So you could track all the money that we spend right on your smartphone, on your tablet, on your computer. I'm a big baseball fan, so we put out a scorecard on the county's finances, which distilled all of our annual reports into the 12 key metrics looking at the county's finances. And we talked about which one's red, which one's yellow, which one's green. Are they going in the right direction, or are they going in the wrong direction? Just recently, we put out an addendum to it, tracking the ARPA money coming down the pike, because that is absolutely so critical to make sure that there's accountability and to make sure that that money gets spent smartly. We put out this report that honestly, nobody read about the guiding principles to making smart investments. It sounds like a snoozer, but it's how do you leverage this stuff, using best practices to make sure that 5 years out, the money was spent smart, the communities benefit, and it created things that are sustainable, that lower operating cost instead of unfunded, ultimately, sort of new programs that you can't replicate in future years. So we're tracking that money, and it was something I wanted to make sure we did. And then we also just launched a community indicators index, which combines our financial transparency and our equity work. It's a map of our county overlaying key measures of our community's health, demographics, economic development. It's a measure of income inequality, education, healthcare, who's insured, who's uninsured, all the sort of the things that you look at, and it shows you graphically on a map where we're at. And that way you can drive resources where you really need to go and communicate it to funders, to the nonprofit community, and really help put resources where they need to be. My greatest hope is that ultimately changes the culture within county government. And while I'd say honestly that we've been phenomenally successful of launching and using these programs, I think it's too soon to say that the culture has changed. And that I think is the work that needs to be done going forward. In any county government, in any local government, anytime you're having any sort of meeting about numbers and finances, and what meeting doesn't include budgets, you really need this information on a big screen in the background, and you need to be able to look up numbers, immediately and get an answer immediately. And I think that's, the whole world ought to run by a dashboard, and in so many ways does run by a dashboard, but all too often government is lagging behind everybody else. And I think from our perspective, we've taken government from worst, maybe not quite yet to first, but certainly we've won most improved player award in the league a few years running. And I'd like to think that we're towards the top of the heap right now. And so that's been one of our biggest achievements. And the other one I think I would mention, we've done some really interesting, innovative audits that are sort of first time out. And I've driven our auditors crazy figuring out ways to do this. We've done a 3-part series on nepotism. In New York State, Teddy Roosevelt invented the civil service system and the merit-based system in the late 1890s, and with all the right things, and because New York State had Tammany Hall. And all too often, all of that still exists. And the result of it is the right people don't get the right jobs for the right reasons. The wrong people do. And when you extrapolate that over a big workforce, it's wildly inefficient. And of course, it's wrong. So we've really taken a hard look at systemic approaches and policies to changing that culture to a merit-based culture, so that every college student in our region knows that they have a fair shake of getting a good job in government, doing good things that will make their communities better. I'm hopeful that that is a real legacy going forward. And then finally, I would just mention that our policy reports are sort of my baby. We have a region that hasn't embraced change and has been losing its competitive advantage, right? Used to be, everyone said, no one's ever leaving New York. It's New York. Come on. We have the best education. We have everything. And we do. We have this, what we call the deal of living where we live, right? It's access to New York City and education and jobs and beaches and all kinds of all the parks, all the things that make our region worthwhile. And yet young people are leaving at a staggering rate. So we've done an entire report series, starting with who are we and what are our demographics, moving towards, pushing on the census to get everybody counted. We've done a whole series on equity, talking about how if racial and equality gaps were closed in our region, it would strengthen our economy by $24 billion. And so doing the right thing is not just right, but it will lower everybody else's taxes ultimately. And that hopefully appeals to those that we have trouble appealing to normally. And we have a region where young people are leaving. And nationally, young people 20-somethings live with their parents at about 16%. In our region, that number's 44%. So we got work to do. We have real work to do to modernize our competitive offering as a region to residents, to businesses, so that people really want to live, work, and play and raise their families here. Nobody wants to be part of a sinking ship. Everybody wants to be in a place that is vibrant. And we've put out a series of reports about all this. And I got to say, a lot of this work, whether it be the nepotism audit, whether it be these reports sort of getting at the tough questions, or the financial transparency piece, a lot of this work makes folks uncomfortable. And you have to be upfront and honest about that, right? It challenges the status quo. There's always somebody that says, it'd be better if we didn't quite touch this issue right now. And then as the issue ripens, everyone turns around and says, how come nobody's talking about this? I would just say my takeaway from all of it is I ran for this office to do exactly this work and in exactly this way. And I'm able to exit now having zero regrets, because we did what we came to do and what we set out to do, and really didn't compromise on that work, even when it got a little uncomfortable for folks, sometimes. And I think that's something that, people don't, always talk about. In retrospect, success and achievement, sounds inevitable. And in the moment, it never is, right? It's really hard. And people are always saying, don't do it, or you're doing it wrong, or nobody could possibly do that, whatever the case may be. And so I think I would just say to other folks who are looking at taking on tough challenges, it's never going to have an engraved invitation. And by the time engraved invitation were to come, it's always too late.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. You have done so much great work, and I'm so glad you touched on most of the stuff I wanted to make sure we got to talk about. Why is it so hard? Why do people, you obviously talked about a little bit about just that it makes people uncomfortable. And so politically, maybe it's a little bit of a third rail, but why is it so hard to use data and evidence as kind of the basis for decision-making? And for anybody who wants to start doing more of that, where do you even start to get your head around that?
So I heard this great quote recently, which is new to me, but probably not new to others, which is, everybody loves transformation, but nobody likes change.
I love that. I love that.
And that's what it really comes down to, right? Everybody wants to talk about this, the amazing success story that, something dramatically transform, but nobody wants to take on the scary piece of change. And I think that's, to me, that's the common denominator, because more often than not, a lot of the policy solutions are known. And I know I and others in New Deal, we all spend so much energy finding the smartest, best ways to do things. When I think a lot of the time, what's lacking is not good ideas, but the political will. Mm-hmm. Making tough choices is hard because they're tough choices. I think about where, our county's finances were at the beginning of the term. And I think about this fascinatingly kooky experience I had addressing our legislature for the first time. Our legislature, a lot of the legislators, particularly on the Republican side, have been there for decades, since the legislature itself started in the mid-90s. And so they say to me, after I laid out all the challenges that we saw financially and looking over the finances, they said, so what are your big ideas? What do you got? And honestly, this was not an honest conversation. Their plan was to sort of be against whatever I said. And my thought was, you don't want to hear ideas. You've been on this dais for 25 years, 30 years. You've heard every idea that's come down the pike. In my office, there's binders of ways to, improve the county's finances. There's no shortage of brilliant ideas. But for whatever reason, good, bad, or indifferent, nobody has found a path to yes on all these things. There's been no, this is the menu of choices I'm willing to say yes to. So that's the real question, right? What are you willing to do? Not what's the new idea. There's no wizard. I think people look for like a magical wizard a lot of the time, particularly on financial matters. And I have learned now that is really dangerous thinking.
Yeah.
There's always a smart idea, but more importantly, there's got to be the guts to actually go ahead and do what you know to be right.
Well, and I mean, that takes a couple different forms, right? You've got, you touched on this, but one of the questions I wanted to ask you was about culture change, because I think it's something we don't talk enough about, frankly, in government. And, great leaders often have to come in and change a culture. And what you're talking about is, really a culture change, whether it's the nepotism piece or just, the transparency and the accountability that inevitably comes with transparency, right? If you put things out there, people can measure you, people can see whether you're doing a good job or not. So how did you come in thinking about culture change in the government?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. So I've been involved in, this is my third culture change experience in government. First in a town called Brookhaven, which had previously been called Crookhaven. Then in the city of Long Beach, a small seaside city that is very parochial and doesn't like to change. And now in a much bigger Nassau County and 1.4 million population. Culture change is not easy because you have to generate buy-in. I can come in, and I've sort of learned this the hard way, as I know a lot of folks have. You can come in with all the best ideas, and then someone will say, "That's nice. I've heard this. I've heard ideas like yours come and go for decades, and I was here before you, and I'll be here after you, and that's all well and good." And so I think culture change starts with buy-in and showing people, what they get on the other side of that culture change. And to be honest, I think that's the place. After 4 years in Nassau County government, I think we've put up extraordinary accomplishments, and it's a little self-serving for me to call them extraordinary, but I think they are. I think on a culture change level, we've moved the needle, but not completely, right? We'll see where it goes, because those that want to, go back to the former culture, they can and they might. It's a placeholder for culture change. We've talked about modernization. We have to do things. We have to deliver services in a modern way to the communities that we have, not the community that we had 50 years ago, but the community that we're going to have tomorrow. We have to do things in the best way from a technology standpoint. And we try to make the culture change a little less scary and just make it about updating things, and modernization. And from what I've experienced, that helps. It at least helps get a little bit of momentum going. And there's always someone there to tell you why it's done the way it is and why it, should be that way, or why it's hard or scary to do it any different. And I think that just takes time, and takes having a core team that really is as committed to that culture change as humanly possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like another aspect of this, Jack, might be, getting the public buy-in too, right? So, politics also requires coalitions and getting people on board and generating that good public will, making government work better. Although clearly a passion of yours and of mine is not always the sexiest issue that people think about when they're thinking about electing their leaders. So how do you get the public buy-in on this?
I think that's exactly the right question, because the people who don't want culture to change and don't want improvement for whatever their entrenched reasons are, they're counting on the public staying asleep. So I found that things like 311, for example, things that create responsiveness and interaction in government, they're incredibly powerful. In our office, we did a tip line, report it, reform it at NassauCountyNY.gov. We got the public involved that way, and that we found that helpful. Honestly, in some ways, one of the most popular things that we ever did was publicly advertise in the big regional newspaper for financial professionals to join our independent audit advisory committee. You might think that's kind of a snoozer. And I thought that was, but it generated more engagement from the public than I ever could have imagined in our first year, because people said, hey, you're asking us to get involved. You're opening up the doors. This is wild. This is amazing. And so we ended up with this sort of incredibly thoughtful and accomplished group that I joked was like the Supreme Court of auditors, people who had been recently retired, higher ups at Standard & Poor's and places like that, to come in and help, with completely free consulting, essentially, in the county. And that kind of engagement was really powerful. We made things public on our living wage hotline. We made a living wage hotline, 571 wage, and we did it in, a multilingual, more language access oriented capacity than had ever been done before. So things like that, and a lot of social media, honestly, trying to show people value from our financial transparency stuff. We did Fact Fridays and things like that of, hey, if you take a look at this portal, you might find out this. Honestly, this is in a nerdy office like Comptroller, it's not easy, right? It is not easy to get people to wake up and pay attention. So we tried to do our level best to take on issues that they care about and to show value on what we call the so that. The so that is, we do this work of making things more efficient, of finding waste, of improving operations so that resources can drive to the communities that we care about. And that actually really helped our line level employees in our claims department, for example, who were paid way too little to do way too much. And they were really the front line of defense for the taxpayers. And in terms of driving money into our communities to nonprofits, particularly during COVID, that kind of morale booster for our line employees, we found, to be honest, on the political side, when I ran for office, my pollster gave me some sobering news that said, our message of cleaning up government, saving taxpayer dollars, modernizing things, he said, that's good. It gets you to like a 2-point loss. But when you add the so that was an additional 7-point swing.
Yeah, and you're in a tough district. You're very much in a swing district, just for listeners to understand the context of that sentence. Yeah.
Yes. To be candid, we are in a region that demographically has been steadily moving Democratic, and yet I would argue the strongest red wave that you saw in the country this year was in our region. It was not just the national environment, but there were New York State specific issues that really resonated for voters, and Democratic turnout in communities that we need to care didn't come through. And I think that there's real work to do there.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit more about kind of just your outlook on, using transparency data. You mentioned ARP dollars, right? I mean, we've got ARP with this infrastructure bill just passed. State and localities are about to get a lot of money to do some really fantastic things that are, to your point, can be transformative, although I think that word scares people, so I hesitate to use it. But, I think that can really address some long-standing issues, particularly around equity and inequity and things like access to services and other stuff. I know that equity played a big part of the way you thought about your work. Can you just talk a little bit more about how you use data and transparency to address some of those kind of things that you where you want to make sure that the results are happening for communities where there's real gaps?
Absolutely. So, I mean, our community has big tranches of money coming down the pike, I'll say, and it creates a financial inflection point for a county that for decades has had a state control board overseeing the finances and really can't get out of its own way financially. It's a real inflection point suddenly. And I think, we're just maybe a more stark example of what a lot of places were facing. As COVID hit the biggest wave financially, worst, obviously public health wise, but from a financial perspective, worst case scenario, biggest financial crisis county's ever faced. Now, because of the good work that was done locally and nationally and such, there's real resources coming in. And so this could be a watershed moment towards financial sustainability and towards really, really addressing systemic issues in our communities if we make the smart choices. And I was joking, and nobody read our report about making those smart choices. At least I shouldn't say nobody in general, nobody in our county, because there was we know the great pander here, right? We're going to cut fees on this. We're going to, do that. And as opposed to taking this long-term approach, because the truth is, if you use this money towards things that lower operational costs financially, you'll be in a better place financially going forward. But if you leverage the money towards addressing systemic problems, whether they be equity, for example, which we really made an argument about childcare, for example, things that would have an economic return, which produces sales tax revenue and so on and so forth. But it's an investment in the well-being of our communities that pays off in a better economy, and ultimately, government's finances improve when the regional economy improves. And so my job is to look out for government's finances. And my argument was, well, the best way you can improve the government's finances is by investing in our communities in a way, whether it be in infrastructure, whether it be in childcare, whether it be in equity issues that close those sort of equity gaps, that get us into a place where we achieve our potential as a community. And, it's the old cliche of a rising tide lifts all boats. This is where we need to be. For whatever reason, it is not readily apparent to people. We just put out different versions of the same report. Honestly, we put out our series of equity reports. We then started doing, here's our equity gap toolkit, which was a fancy way of saying, if you didn't read the first three and you didn't decide to care until now, here's a toolkit, a greatest hits album of, the top 5 steps you could take right now to finally address these issues. And then if we can get you interested, maybe you'll go back and you'll read the source material, whether it be, closing equity gaps or investing in workforce development or this sort of pandemic relief. And we really have made a big push on childcare. It's one of the biggest cost drivers in our region, obviously nationally as well. But here in New York State, it costs more to put a kid through childcare than it does tuition to a SUNY school. And everybody saves to put their kids through college. And nobody that I have ever met has had the foresight to say, I'm going to have a kid. I'm going to save for childcare. So it's, but you need to. It's that expensive.
Yes. Well, not only that, I mean, you have to get yourself on lists before you're pregnant. I mean, it's the whole system is really just crazy.
Yeah, it's a broken system.
It's a broken system. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jack, I want to make sure we've got time to talk a little bit about your path into public service. This is an honorable profession, as you know, and we like to talk about just the nobility of this work, which you've really obviously talked about so much right now about the difference you're making. But you came into this office, with already a reputation as kind of a turnaround artist in government. And you mentioned both your work in Long Beach and in Brookhaven. You went to Tufts, you got your master's in public policy at Harvard. Did you think you were going to go into government from the get-go, or where did you think you were headed?
So I wasn't sure whether I would go. I think my plan was all the above. It was, where could I go to be part of the action, to make a difference, to learn, and to just move the needle on issues that I care about. And kind of agnostic, and I still kind of am, honestly, between whether that at any given moment is in government or the nonprofit sector or the private sector or whatever else I'm not thinking of. And I wasn't necessarily planning on running for office. In fact, I had been thinking about moving into the nonprofit sector after my experience in city government. And a situation arose where our county was really struggling. There were a series of corruption scandals. And after looking over all the possible people who could run for office, they didn't seem to be wanting to do it. And I thought, you know what? I think I can make a difference here. And I did not get the engraved invitation from the sort of powers that be and the party and all that stuff. I took a bit of an audacious step and said, I think I can do this. I want this job. I want to do this work. And okay, the job interview is an election. What the heck? Let's go for it. And I jumped out there and did the really hard work that nobody wants to talk about of raising money. There is nothing harder than raising money as a first-time candidate over the holidays with everything on the line to show in that first filing period in January that you are viable. And nobody warned me and prepared me for that. I'll be honest. I knew that raising money would be hard. Of course it's hard. But oh my goodness, explaining to people what's a controller? Why do you want to be a controller? Why do you want to do this? Why is this? Why do you think you could do this? You've never, been on a level of government this big before. This is a big leap. All those things that you hear. And particularly, candidly, if you don't come to the table from the wealthiest family or all the connections and all that kind of stuff, it was one of those gut check moments, all in moments I'll never forget. It was terrifying. It was, you wake up at 4 a.m. with that pit burning in your stomach. And ultimately, it was really gratifying to be able to say, well, I outraised people. I'm here. I'm ready. I've got, more donors than anybody else. Like, let's do it.
If there's so many people listening, Jack,
that was tough.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to follow up with a follow-up question there, because there's so many people listening to this podcast who are thinking about running for office, I think. And you're so candid, and that's such a wonderful thing to share with people. So what did you do? How did you even think about it? Did you go out to your friends and family? Where do you start?
So I did what they sort of tell you to do, is say, what's my path to my first $100,000? And I made a list of everyone I could ask for money and how much I might be able to ask them for. Some of them gave more, some of them gave less, some of them didn't give. Some of them, came through in ways I never would have imagined. Then I had to go back to them again, which I didn't know was part of the process. It's one thing to get somebody who's not used to giving money to give you money, and it's hard and it's personal. And there's another thing to say, I can't thank you enough for supporting me, and I need you one more time. And my fundraiser said something to me, which I'll never forget, which was, you're now the most expensive friendship that all of your friends have. It really was not a fun moment in realizing that. I'll tell you, there was a day I realized maybe I can do this fundraising thing. I was making fundraising calls, and they tell you to make a specific ask. And some of the first ones, I honestly didn't have the guts to make a specific ask, or I didn't know how much to ask for. And I made this fundraising call to someone that I'd known and I respected, and I thought maybe he would be willing to be supportive. And he said, before I could chicken out on the specific ask, he said, I'm not going to tell you how much I'm going to give. I'm going to send you a check. And I figured, it's not like I just took maybe $1,000 supporter and raised $100 out of it. And I keep up at this rate and I'm out of this thing in a heartbeat. And the check arrived, and it was dramatically more money, with a note that said, I believe in you. We need to do this. Let's go. And I was so moved and fired up and thought, okay, I'm going to spend my holiday season making calls, like a lunatic. And then when it's too late to make calls on the East Coast, I'm going to call my friends on the West Coast. And, it's just one of those things.
It's hard work.
It's not easy to do.
It's hard
work.
It is. I'm glad you talked about that. It's not something we often talk about on the show. So thank you for diving in on that a little bit. I want to ask you, Another question, you recently announced you're not going to seek a second term. I often get to ask people about why they chose to run for office and what factors go into deciding to run for office. So I want to ask you, what factors go into deciding not to run for an office? What was your thinking?
A lot of them. A lot of them. So I'll start with the most personal, honestly, is when I ran for office the first time, my daughter, who was then turning 2, stopped letting me be part of bedtime. Because I was out every night, and the 1 or 2 nights that I was home every now and again, she just wasn't used to me. Then when COVID hit, I put my daughter to bed every single night. Now she's a bit older. And the idea of stopping that and going out every single night again on the rubber chicken dinner circuit, 3 events of people who have already made their decisions, for you, against you, hoot and holler and yelling. It just didn't really appeal to me. And, I have all the accomplishments of the work we've done, all the scars, candidly, and the knife marks of the tough change that I've carried. And it was the right decision for me and my family not to look to go through all that again at this moment. And it turns out it was not an easy decision at the time. And I thought it was a really good time to make the pivot that I'd originally thought about making out of government. I've been in government for 10 years, and it's a really healthy time for change. Tom Brady says you can't, even though I'm a New York fan, Tom Brady says you can't keep doing the same thing for too long. It's a bad idea. So I thought that was that seemed like a really healthy thing to do. I'm not going to pretend that I had the political clairvoyance to know that everybody was going to get creamed this year, but they did. And in retrospect, I now know that I would have run. I would have put my heart and soul into it and worked myself and my team to the bone, and almost certainly would have lost, no matter how wonderful the work that I put out was, because that's just where things were in the political environment this year. So I feel real happy and relieved. Happy is the wrong word, but more relieved that, I was able to take a moment, pivot, and spend the time strategic planning towards how I want to make a difference in the future, how I want things to work for my family in the future. My kids are little, 6 and soon to be 4. And I feel like I've made a really healthy decision for my family. Public service is in my blood 100%. So there's no world where I'm not involved in every kind of way, but there's so many different ways to serve. And for me at this moment, the right way to serve, I think, is what I'm moving forward with. And I feel real good about that.
Yeah. Well, I have no doubt, knowing you, and that you will make a difference in whatever it is you choose to do next. And as somebody who's watched your amazing, really, tenure in Nassau County and doing some stuff that's national in scope in terms of what people can learn from, what people can emulate, what people can steal from, just a big thank you for putting yourself out there and doing all this work. And I'm looking forward to working with you in whatever capacity that public service continues to take in the future.
Thank you so much. And I should just say, by the way, that NewDEAL has been, as I know I told you at the conference recently, NewDEAL has been one of the highlights of my time. The ability to learn from others, to be part of a network of peers who are doing similar difficult work, regardless of where they are in the country, who sort of understand what it's like. That is worth everything. It's the thing that we talked about in graduate school, of having those sort of allies and staying alive in a difficult environment. It's meant so much for me. And when I made my pro-con list about, am I running this year? Am I not running this year? As strange as it sounds, NewDEAL was on the list of, well, wait, if I don't run, does it mean that I can't be a NewDEAL anymore?
Well, that means the world to me. And of course, once your family. So you're not getting away that easy, even if you're not in office. But thank you so much, Jack. Thanks for taking the time in your final days here to tell us about your tenure. It's been just a delight to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie.
Thanks for listening to An Honorable Profession. Please subscribe to hear more amazing leaders. And keep asking your elected officials to be honorable. Boots Row Group produces podcast. I'm Ryan Coonerty, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars were used in the making of this podcast.